Hey, my name's Sam. Welcome to Brickwall Pictures. Today I will be reviewing Clive Barker's Books of Blood, Volumes 1, 2, and 3. This is 3 volumes of horror short stories gathered into one big-ass collection. There is a second compendium, which includes volumes 4 through 6, but I'll save those for another time. I'll be talking about the collection overall and each story individually, and I won't be spoiling any of them either, so this review will remain entirely spoiler-free. But first, I have to do my self-promo duty of recommending that you check out my debut novel, The Fall of Plight. It's a gritty tale of survival and revenge set in a post-apocalyptic New England in the dead of winter. It's available in paperback and on Kindle. The link is in the description. And I have other videos on this channel that go into more detail about The Fall of Plight. Also, if you happen to have a Kindle Unlimited membership, you can actually read the book on your Kindle right now for free. It's in their program. So check it out. Okay, now back to the Books of Blood. As a massive horror fan, Clive Barker is a name I have been familiar with for many years. My first experiences with his work were through his films, The Excellent Candyman and Hellraiser, the latter of which he also directed. They make for a great 1-2 punch introduction to his style, if you're looking for a place to start. I would say the Books of Blood also make for a great starting point with his work as well, if you're more of a reader than a watcher. There's quite a lot of variety across the Books of Blood, but a fair amount of overlap as well, as one would expect. The Books of Blood arrived at the very start of Clive Barker's writing career, and they display many of his interests and fixations and stylistic quirks that Barker would go on to explore in more depth throughout his career. The blending of sexuality and horror was present right from the very beginning, as was the mixing of grounded violence with more fantastical elements. Now let's take a closer look at each short story. We'll go in order, starting out with the namesake of the short story collection, The Book of Blood. This short is the best and only appropriate way to open the collection as a whole. It works well as a short story in isolation, but works even better as a framing device for the entire collection. The short concerns the idea of a person being a book of blood. This concept actually takes 2 slightly different forms in the opening pages of the book. Preceding the short is the quote, "Everybody is a book of blood. Wherever we're opened, we're read." It's a brilliant quote that does well to establish the tone of the ensuant collection. But as does the Book of Blood short story itself, which instead of adopting the premise of everyone being a book of blood, concerns the process by which one individual, a boy, is turned into a book of blood, having every millimeter of his body forcibly etched with the words that comprise the following stories. It's a great opening to the collection, and also the shortest story of the bunch, clocking in at just 12 pages. But even at just 12 pages, this one feels a little longer than necessary. The juicy bits are only in the last couple of pages, and there are a couple of ancillary characters that we learn about who do not end up mattering a significant degree in the story being told, so they don't really need to be there. Feels a little tacked on to elongate it to 12 pages, which is still pretty short. The short on its own was adapted into a feature film, The Book of Blood, and was also one of the segments in the recent Hulu film, Books of Blood. The second story in the collection is The Midnight Meat Train. This one was also turned into a feature film, but not a very good one. It's okay, it's watchable. But it doesn't use its expanded length to explore more of the interesting horror world that arrives at the end of the short story, opting instead to spend much of its runtime with a boring Bradley Cooper protagonist, instead of the far more interesting Vinnie Jones antagonist. But forget about the movie. How is the short? It's better, much better. Whereas the first story felt a little longer than necessary, I think Midnight Meat Train is perfect length. It's intriguing throughout, and it gives you just enough of a glimpse at the earth-shaking bigger picture at the very end. The fascinating, disturbing elements do not outstay their welcome, and their brevity adds to their effectiveness, in my eyes. The Yattering and Jack is the third story in the collection. This one easily stands out from the others as a distinctive piece of work. It could potentially prove polarizing for some readers, but I really dug it. Rather than a human protagonist, like the other stories all have, the Yattering and Jack is told from the perspective of a Yattering. It's a little demon of Clive Barker's own creation. The Yattering is sent from hell and tasked with annoying, disgruntling, and otherwise frightening a seemingly unflappable man to whose house he is bound. I would call this the most lighthearted story in the bunch, and it can be pretty funny throughout. There's a good escalation and some twists and turns to add to the enjoyment. This one will definitely not scare, unnerve, or creep you out if that's all you want from a horror short story. Doesn't really make any attempt to. It's not what this one's about. It's not what it's going for. Next up is Pig Blood Blues. Such a great title. This one is set at a boarding school where a rumor is circulating that one of the students has been magically transformed into the pig that lives on the property. There are some nice grotesque descriptions of the pig, and the protagonist is well drawn and likable. But this story was missing an extra layer to me. I found it a bit too straightforward, with no surprises along the way and no twist or revelation to seal the deal. Sex, Death, and Starshine is the penultimate story in the first volume, and it's definitely the weakest of this first volume to me. This one never grabbed me. Sex, Death, and Starshine is set in the theater world and explores the themes of beauty, fame, and longevity. There's potential here, and there are a couple of good moments, but the moment-to-moment plot all felt like things I had seen executed better or explored more thoroughly in other stories, even in other Clive Barker stories, and the ending underwhelmed me. Now we jump from one short that didn't work so well for me to one that worked exceedingly well for me. In the Hills, the Cities is not just my favorite story in the first volume, but my favorite story from the entire Books of Blood collection. I love this one. I really don't want to spoil anything at all from this one, which means there isn't much I can say about the plot or premise other than it follows a gay couple on a road trip through Eastern Europe, while two rival cities, isolated from broader society, gear up for a special once-in-a-generation event. It's a great story that feels wholly unique and consistently fascinating in execution. In the Hills, the Cities hold a special place in my heart because there was a single line of prose in this that gave me the spark of inspiration that led to one of my feature film scripts that I wrote this year. One consistent through-line element across H.P. Lovecraft stories, of which there are many, is the idea of witnessing something so impossibly horrific that your mental state cracks in that moment and delirious insanity follows. I've noticed this element is present in many of Clive Barker's stories as well, and for my money, In the Hills, the Cities pulls it off better than any of the others. Now we move into Volume 2. Volume 1 had 6 short stories, while Volume 2 and 3 have just 5 stories each, but the page count remains roughly the same from Volume 1 to 2 and actually increases in Volume 3. The first story of Volume 2 is simply titled Dread. This is one of the slowest of the entire collection, and to me it felt like the longest, despite being beaten by a couple of other stories. It's a lot of build-up, and while the payoff delivers, at least for the most part, I didn't really feel that creeping sense of dread throughout the build-up that I believe I was meant to be feeling. It's good, not great, I would say. The characters are complex and interesting, but I wasn't gripped or overly invested in finding out where it was going. Hell's Event is the second story of Volume 2, and it's on the weaker side of the collection, but certainly not to the extreme end. It's very well written with some effectively grotesque descriptions of bodily horror and an interesting vision of a frozen hell. The problem doesn't lie in the execution, but rather in the premise, which to me just comes off as a little bit goofy. It's basically that an envoy of hell has been sent to participate in a foot race that could determine the fate of mankind. I just struggle to take hell needing to win a foot race seriously. If that doesn't sound too goofy to you, then you'll probably really dig this story, as outside of that core premise, the execution is excellent. Next up, we have another favorite of mine, Jocelyn S., Her Will and Testament. In the Hills, the Cities is my favorite of the entire collection, and Jocelyn S. handily nabs the number 2 spot. I won't say much about the plot of this one, especially because it's on the shorter side, and any meaningful details could spoil the experience. The violence in this one is truly disturbing, and it describes the human body in ways I have never seen, heard, or read it described. The body horror is top-notch in this one. I'm sure David Cronenberg would love to have made this story as a film. I think Jocelyn S. is the perfect concoction of sensuality intermingling with fucked up horror that Clive Barker has explored time and again across his various works. Next up is The Skins of the Fathers. Of all the Clive Barker stories that have been adapted into films, I'm surprised Skins of the Fathers hasn't been one of them. This one feels inherently cinematic. Everything about it, from the setting to the plot to the pacing and even the cast of characters and the level of spectacle and action, they all feel geared towards cinematic portrayal. Perhaps this story might even fare better in movie form. As it stands in short story form, there are plenty of interesting moments, some cool creature designs, surprising moments of gruesome violence, and a fun escalation from lone encounter with a monster on a desert highway to an entire community gearing up and banding together to fight back against a supernatural threat. As a short, though, the big picture is just a little bit underwhelming. I think it comes down to there being too many characters and or not enough time spent with each of them. This premise is asking for an expanded format, whether it be a film or a novel that can more fully develop each of these characters and can build the lore of the looming enemy threat to a greater degree. The close of Volume 2 is one of the weaker stories in my eyes. Definitely the weakest of Volume 2 and possibly the weakest of the overall collection. New Murders in the Rue Morgue. It's an Edgar Allan Poe flavored thriller that plays out much more like a mystery than a horror story. The mystery just isn't all that engaging, and the eventual reveal left me woefully underwhelmed. I didn't find the twist creepy or even all that interesting. Without spoiling it, the twist reminded me of those bad 50s sci-fi B-movies rather than anything to be afraid of or to take seriously. And now we're into Volume 3, which opens with Son of Celluloid. I like the title again. This one concerns a runaway criminal who seeks refuge in a movie theater only to pass away and have his spirit inhabit the theater, bringing life to the images of motion pictures in vignette-esque horror set pieces. I like the start of Son of Celluloid a good deal, but it fell into a little bit of the goofy territory for me as it went along, similar to the nature of Hell's Event. with a little bit of sex, death, and starshine thrown in the mix. When the cinema images begin taking life, that's where it started to lose me. There's a section where a cowboy vision of John Wayne started squaring off with a theater goer, and it was kind of a jump the shark moment for me. It reminded me of the parts that I really didn't like in Clive Barker's movie Nightbreed, or some of the goofier dreams in the Nightmare on Elm Street sequels. By the time Marilyn Monroe was coming to life, Son of Celluloid had actually started to sort of win me back over a little bit. It remained a little goofy to me, conceptually speaking, but the prose pushed past that layer of cheese into something far more interesting. The twisting of an icon's persona into something so deeply dark, it was interesting. I'm a little torn on Son of Celluloid. It has a lot that I like and a lot that I don't like. Next up is Rawhead Rex. The film version of Rawhead Rex is uber goofy, but the short story version is great. It's one of the longest of the whole collection, and it jumps between many different perspectives and characters without any of them feeling underwritten or bland in the way that the similar perspective jumps in The Skins of the Fathers did. Rawhead Rex is a straight-up monster movie plot. It should work in cinematic form. That's one remake I could get on board with. Maybe if Barker directed it himself, or just someone with good horror chops. Rawhead Rex, as he's described in the short story, is freaky and seriously intimidating. The way Barker described his internal monologue with a sort of naive, compulsory attitude toward the world and the violence he performs is extremely engaging. The ending isn't exactly what I wanted to see, but it's an ending I can respect. Not perfectly in line with my tastes, but there's certainly nothing wrong with the ending. Rawhead Rex is a great one. I'd go as far as to call it a highlight of the collection. My favorite of Volume 3, to be sure. Following Rawhead Rex is Confessions of a Pornographer's Shroud. This one has some compelling visuals and a few satisfying moments, but suffers from perhaps being a bit too ambitious given the limited page count. There are a ton of characters crammed into these pages, and some of them get lost in the shuffle, and feeling too similar to each other, not distinctive enough, The story feels overstuffed and even a little bloated, but it's not bad. This one's a little on the forgettable side too, not an essential story in the collection. I would say overall it's higher quality than a story like Son of Celluloid, but it's also far less interesting. Now for the penultimate short story, Scapegoats. Scapegoats is about some people stranded on an island and... that's pretty much it. There are some sheep, there are some skulls, This one did nothing for me. It wasn't bad, there weren't any glaring issues, but at the same time there wasn't really anything that it did that I liked. Aside from a brief moment of prose toward the end that was very well described, involving scratching on the underside of a boat. It's also the only story in the entire collection told in first person rather than third person. I wonder if maybe Barker's prose just flows better for this kind of thing in third person. Scapegoats is bland. There might not be any specific problems with what's here, but there's so much that isn't here. I think that emptiness might be enough to secure the bottom of the overall ranking of stories in this collection. It doesn't particularly feel like a Clive Barker story either. It feels like any number of other authors could have penned this one, which isn't something I can say about any of the other stories in this collection. Maybe New Murders in the Rue Morgue. Possibly that one. And finally, we reach the close of the Books of Blood, with the simply titled Human Remains. And luckily, it's a great one. This one follows a male prostitute who gets mixed up in something dark and supernatural. I won't say anything more about the plot. The sense of intrigue here is excellent. There are little breadcrumbs to pick up and stew on as the plot progresses, and the protagonist is one of the best in the whole collection, too. He's an interesting, complex, flawed individual, and following his journey works extremely well. Clive Barker has said that he, at one point, worked as a prostitute himself when money was tight, so I'm sure he was able to pull from his own experiences to add a great deal of specificity and depth to this character. Human Remains ends the Books of Blood on a high note. Overall, an excellent collection of short stories with plenty of variety. The high points are skyscrapers, and the low points aren't really all that low in the grand scheme of things. I fully recommend the Books of Blood. The particular stories that I highlighted as the best get special recommendations to check out at the very least. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more stuff like this, and check out my novel, The Fall of Polite. Link is in the description. I'll see you in the next video, and yes, this is my real voice. That's what I sound like. If you don't like it, you can leave. I don't really care. Bye.